Hi, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar entitled COVID-19 CNS Clinical Trial Contingency Plans for Sponsors and Investigator Sites. My name is Janine Estrada, and I'll be one of your speakers as well as your moderator today. Before I have the pleasure of introducing my colleagues, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording after the event is complete. During the presentation today, we invite your comments and questions, which can be added in the interaction panel on the right of your webinar screen. If you think of a question at any point during the presentation, please add it there and we'll hold it for our Q&A portion at the end of the event. Without further ado, I would like to introduce my colleagues and today's speaker. First and foremost, Dr. Gary Zamet, President and CEO of ClinLabs, Ms. Allie House, Vice President of Strategic Development Services, and Dr. Lewis Kirby, Medical Monitor. Dr. Zamet, thank you for getting us started today.
Thank you very much, Janine. And thank all of you for attending today. We're holding this webinar because we recognize that the COVID-19 pandemic has presented significant challenges to the conduct of clinical trials. Challenges may arise, for example, from quarantines, site closures, travel limitations, interruptions to the supply chain for investigational product, or other factors, including the infection of staff and subjects. We hope that today's session will touch on a number of issues related to contingency planning, and we want to prescribe, and this is not meant to prescribe a specific plan of action, but rather to open a dialogue about the ways that sponsors and investigator sites can deal with the pandemic. Some of the considerations we discuss are specific to what goes on in CNS clinical trials. Let's go to the next, to this slide. Sorry, can we back up to a prior slide? Thank you. Yeah, so thank you. So we know that on March 18, the FDA issued guidance on the conduct of clinical trials during the COVID-19 pandemic. This guidance provides sponsors with information that will help assure the safety of clinical trial participants, GCP compliance, and will assist them in minimizing risk to trial integrity. The guidance indicates that safety is paramount. However, the guidance also acknowledges that the safety and welfare of subjects may be best served by continuing them in their clinical trials per protocol. The guidance endorses alternative methods for study conduct, including subject assessment, and it suggests that those alternative methods should be consistent with the current protocol, should involve the revision of policies and procedures, presumably written policies and procedures, and should include a record of the contingency measures that have been implemented in study documents, including the clinical study report. Notably, the guidance does not indicate that any special COVID-19 screening procedures would need to be included as an amendment to any protocol. Let's go to the next slide. Thank you. For sponsors as well as investigator sites that are considering the management of clinical trials during the COVID-19 outbreak, we would consider that those trials that are in the planning phase really have few impediments to continuation during this phase. Project managers, clinical trial associates, medical writers, biostatisticians, and other key study personnel primarily are home-based in most CROs and in fact in most sponsors. So that work toward the clinical trial can continue to go on. Even as we get into site selection, kickoff meetings, and investigator meetings, those activities may be held by video conference. There's a different set of circumstances after a study has been activated. And sponsors and investigator sites may have several things to consider. The first, if we go down to the last bullet on the list, relates to the potential discontinuation of a project. Discontinuation might be considered if it was being considered prior to the COVID outbreak, or if enrollment is nearly complete um, and there may be a statistical plan to analyze data early, or if sites are not at all able to see subjects because of the nature of the protocol, or perhaps even if there is a supply chain interruption and the investigator site is unable to obtain drug to dispense or administer to subjects. So discontinuation may be a consideration. However, based on our experience with investigator sites thus far, we know that many investigator sites want to continue seeing clinical trial subjects. Those subjects may be seen in protocols without modification. And these might be subjects who are really receiving benefit from participation in a clinical trial. And these are subjects who really should not be abandoned. Perhaps those participating in a phase 2 or pivotal phase 3 trial where they are truly receiving benefit from their participation with regard to their symptom presentation and course of illness. Um, Other trials may be continued with a contingency plan. Sponsors might consider using telemedicine services, or sites may consider applying telemedicine practices in their own clinics, perhaps modifying the number of visits, the number of procedures performed, or even the location at which the procedures will take place. And then finally, some studies may be placed on hold. Um, Placing studies on hold might be something that would be especially considered for those projects that don't provide immediate benefit to subjects or to society, or for which continuation may pose a heightened risk to subjects and staff. There could be some observational studies or phase 1 studies that fall into this category, studies that could reasonably be postponed until the COVID risk is significantly reduced. Next slide. Yes, thank you. Now, when it comes to um, considering these contingency plans and alternative methods that have been endorsed by FDA, how does one go about that? One can submit a formal protocol amendment to the Institutional Review Board. This, of course, would be done by the sponsor with the support of the investigator sites. Um, and the Institutional Review Board would be happy to consider that formal amendment. However, during the crisis, we know that IRBs are accepting abbreviated submissions for protocol amendments. Some IRBs may even consider a letter of amendment, a write-up that is not necessarily submitted in the same way that a formal amendment might have been submitted prior to the crisis, but more of a formal letter that spells out the protocol changes, spells them out clearly, pays attention to subject health and safety, which of course is identified as paramount in the FDA guidance, um, and and the IRBs will accept those documents when they're submitted as soon as practicable. Next slide. The current regulatory guidance does allow IRBs to adapt to the current situation. And in fact, the commercial IRBs that we've been in contact with really are doing a wonderful job of supporting the continuation of research activity. Of course, their primary concerns relate to the protection of human subjects, rights and safety. Their concern relates to compliance with regulatory guidance and adherence to sound ethical and scientific principles. We do know that some IRBs are willing to allow sponsors and investigator sites to make changes on the spot in order to protect the health and safety of human subjects. So those on the spot changes may be allowed, and the IRB would expect to be informed um, after the fact and will make allowances for that. Recently, the WERB Copernicus Group IRBs said that they would seek notification of such on-the-spot changes within 5 days of those changes taking place. So the IRBs, the commercial IRBs and academic IRBs are certainly working in the most diligent ways and in the most supportive ways to adapt to the coronavirus crisis. Next slide. With regard to informed consent, of course, prior to entry into a trial, informed consent, written informed consent is required. It's been noted that informed consent is not simply an act, it is a process. We prefer that informed consent be obtained in the traditional way that it would normally be obtained at the site. However, in response to modifications or adaptations of the protocol to the coronavirus crisis, informed consent may be adapted. So the original consent form may be revised and subjects may be reconsented. The original consent form may be modified by an addendum. Some IRBs will accept that. The informed consent form may even consist of a memo to subjects, or the revision of the consent form may be submitted to subjects in the form of a memo with their acknowledgement. And finally, informed consent may consist of other oral or written communications to the subjects. It would be important to contact your IRB, the IRB that's managing your project, and determine what that IRB in particular would consider appropriate and allowable. Whatever is the case, though, we do know that IRBs will want those changes to be documented. Any changes to the informed consent process or informed consent practices should be well documented as a change in policy or as a change in practice. And then each subject's informed consent should be documented in the source documents. So if a subject is reconsented, certainly write a note that can later be posted to the source document. Or if you have access to the source document directly, post it right into the source document. And again, I think the IRBs now are attempting to support research in as many creative ways as possible. So for example, one IRB has commented that subjects could respond to an email or text with their affirmative regarding consent, or they might print out a paper consent form and then take a photo of their signature on that document using their phone or mobile device, and then transmit that photo to the investigator site. So again, the IRBs are willing to adapt, but it's important for us all to remember that informed consent is the foundation on which all of the work that we do at investigator sites is based. Next slide. Janine, I'll turn this over to you.
Sure, thank you. So obviously the challenges brought by the coronavirus are deeply embedded in subject recruitment and retention challenges. And so patient recruitment groups at both sites, working at CROs, are all facing the same issues. How do we cope with canceled screening visits? How do we cope with getting information to patients about their continued participation in studies that have been put on hold? What do we do? So first and foremost, what we are suggesting is to continue telephone and possibly engage web screening if we've not already done so, to pre-screen for eligibility. And what this allows us to do is to continue to build study databases, which will essentially build virtual waiting rooms for individuals who are waiting screening visits, so that when studies do reopen or re-engage, that you'll have a very big pool of individuals who are interested in participating, and we can restart those screening visits promptly. Of course, when doing so, we would now like to include additional questions that will evaluate risk and exposure to COVID-19. I'm sorry, it says COVID-10, it should be COVID-19. And what that'll allow us to do is also try to reduce the risk for those that will come into study once these restrictions for shelter in place, et cetera, have been lifted. Continue to engage and communicate with subjects. We find that that's really important. Subjects are asking about clinic hours, if sites are open, if their screening visits have been canceled. Where do we communicate that? So we can do it in a lot of different ways. We can do it on websites, obviously. We could do it by email, text message, phone calls. And that information should be given to subjects as it becomes available. So every day seems to be a changing scope. So as a study is put on hold or re-engaged, we should communicate that promptly with individuals. It's also really important to communicate measures that are being done at each site to reduce risk of infection. Patients that are interested in study participation want to know that when they're coming in, it's safe. And we also want to make sure that they know that their ongoing visits, if there's changes to procedures, if there's changes to informed consent, that those are being communicated effectively. For CROs, making sure that we're communicating with investigator sites by email, newsletters, webinars, Zoom meetings, teleconferences, whatever it takes to make sure that everybody's on the same page. The second thing that many people are dealing with in patient recruitment is advertising. We're having challenges because placements that may have been secured in the past are no longer either effective, they're more expensive, they're not available. Some media placements that are no longer good investments or are challenging investments are print advertising, shelter advertising, and billboards, simply for the fact that people aren't out and about as they had been in the past. People are not commuting to work. And then some media placements, such as local news stations, television and radio, are much more expensive because they're getting a lot more airtime. Digital social media placements are still pretty effective, but they're taking longer to go live because staff has been reduced for reviewing the creative and content for approvals. So at this point, patient recruitment is taking a seat back, and we're moving into patient engagement strategies where we keep communication open with patients who are in our trials or are approaching entry into a trial. And we are also anticipating a rise in study participation as unemployment rates rise. That's one.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk about on-site study visits versus telemedicine visits. Certainly, I think from a clinical trial perspective, we would prefer regular visit schedules on site, but that may be more challenging to do in this new era of social distancing, particularly in some cities where government is imposing restrictions on the movement of people in and around the city. But if one is able to hold a regular visit schedule, that may be desirable, particularly for some types of trials or some patient populations. But consideration also may be given to modifying visit schedules. This would involve changing the number, the timing, or the location of visits. So for example, some visits in a protocol may be shortened or eliminated. The frequency of those visits might be reduced. Or instead of having a subject come into the clinic for a blood draw, consider having that subject go to a commercial lab for a blood draw. Now, there are considerations there that some commercial labs are, by their own SOPs, not allowed to draw blood and then release the sample elsewhere. They have to process it themselves. But in this crisis, there are a lot of organizations that are willing to adapt and make concessions in order to support clinical research. So checking these things out are a possibility. If the subject is going to be coming into the site for an on-site study visit, whether the number is reduced or the timing is reduced. Keep in mind, as Janine commented, there are a lot of concerns about risk of infection. So consider using individualized appointments with kind of a no-touch procedure management approach. Limit interaction with staff and other subjects. There are some investigator sites that are having subjects wait in their cars rather than come into the facility, so that when their appointment time comes up, that they can be contacted by telephone or text and told that now is their time to come into the clinic, so that they can minimize their interaction with other subjects and even with staff. Signs should be displayed at all entrances to the facility and throughout the facility regarding COVID safety, hand washing, and social distancing, just as the CDC recommends. Before a subject enters the facility, travel, symptom, and temperature screening should take place before they come in. Ask about cough, shortness of breath, and fever to make sure that somebody who may be symptomatic is not now entering the facility. This is an assessment that not only applies to subjects, but should be a daily assessment of staff as well. So before staff come in, we want to make sure that they're safe to be in contact with each other and with their subject populations. Um, in clinic, make sure that respiratory hygiene supplies, including masks, hand sanitizer, and tissues are available. And for those subjects who are identified, or even staff who are identified as being symptomatic, have a plan to safely triage those people to their own healthcare providers in the safest way possible. Let's go to the next slide. So, as an alternative to on-site visits, many investigator sites and sponsors are now considering telemedicine visits. These are assessments that can be done by phone, by video, or even through a HIPAA-compliant telemedicine service. Many electronic medical record providers do have modules that will support telemedicine visits. The module or the system that we've been using, which is produced by a company called CureMD, offers a telemedicine module that is HIPAA compliant and that makes sure that the data are being collected and saved in a way that protects personal health information. If one does decide to use telemedicine visits, the sponsor should determine how the guidance regarding those visits will be provided to investigator sites. And then also the sponsor must determine whether those telemedicine visits will be considered protocol deviations, minor deviations that are allowed, or if a formal protocol amendment or an abbreviated protocol amendment will be submitted to the IRB. Telemedicine applications are commercially available. For example, Metavante Prophase offers both audio and video teleconference centralized rating of subjects. Our own application, which is called Clinical Insight, offers video rater overreads for investigator sites that are rating subjects either remotely by audio or even by video. And then it's important, in particularly, I think, in CNS clinical trials, that we consider the validity of the assessments that can be performed remotely. If an assessment is performed by audio or by video, is it valid? Is it reliable? Well, there's a lot of evidence that supports telephone or video ratings in psychiatric trials. Scales such as the SKID, the HAM-D, the MADRS, or the CDR, all are amenable to telephone or video ratings, and there is a peer-reviewed literature in support of that. Some ratings might be much more difficult to do remotely, such as the ADAS-COG. With regard to neurological assessments, video evidence or video ratings are supported by the evidence in the assessment of movement and motor control, for example. And if we're going to be using any type of telemedicine or self-assessment with subjects assessing vital signs or symptom assessment, AEs, we have to consider, can those effectively be recorded remotely? Let's go to the next slide. I do want to touch briefly on the concept of centralized ratings, particularly in CNS clinical trials. Centralized ratings involve remote, live, centralized assessments of subjects at study sites. I just mentioned Metavante Prophase. Our own application, Clinical Insight, provides those types of centralized live ratings. One of the benefits of these centralized ratings is that remote ratings are conducted by a small team, usually, of experts via telephone or video conference. These teams adhere to a single standard and really help to maximize inter-rater reliability. If we move to rater surveillance, where ratings are done at the investigator site or by the investigator, by audio or by video, those audio samples or video samples can be transferred to a centralized rating organization and have the ratings overread again by that small team of experts. Raters are blinded to subject visit and condition and may provide an unbiased confirmation of the investigator assessments. So the overreading and rater surveillance can be quite valuable. And in using these types of centralized ratings, we know already from their use in clinical trials that they help to minimize variability and improve statistical power in clinical trials. So if there is any kind of small silver lining that can be found throughout this crisis, it may be that our use of telemedicine and centralized ratings may actually help to enhance the methodologies applied in our clinical trials. Next slide. And now I'll move on to, or I'll pass the baton over to Allie.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Zammit. Bear with me one second. I was having a little bit of trouble with my audio there. I hope everyone can hear me now. In response and in follow-up to what Dr. Zammit has presented here today, we wanted to review some of the details regarding digital health apps that really facilitate not only remote ratings, but facilitate clinical trials as a whole. These apps are applicable to not only our CROs and sponsors, or perhaps vendors, but also to sites. There's a multitude of apps available in the field that can help support us as we move forward and navigate the circumstance. Many of these are attributed to enrollment. There are, of course, ones that are suited towards e-qualification, where we're digitally qualifying patients to determine if they're viable candidates for participation. E-consent modules where consent forms can be signed online. Digital signatures and CFR compliant, or as Dr. Zammit noted, the IRBs are offering some type of flexibility in taking pictorial images of signatures, or text or emails in that sense as well. Also, randomization can be facilitated by some apps at this time, such as IRT or vendor related aspects in the industry at this time. Further to that, patient engagement is something that is quite key that Janine was just mentioning a moment ago. At this point, accessibility is very important. So apps can be customized to really support the patient population, meaning that, for instance, in a more elderly population, text or fonts or even button size can be programmed to accommodate individuals who may be in an older population or have challenges with visual access to applications. In addition, notifications and alerts are, quite simple items such as medication reminders or alerts to complete diary entries. And in addition to this, gamification, very important. I know many of you utilize apps at this time, whether you ride with Zwift or a member of MyFitnessPal, or even one of my favorites, Untapped. You can earn badges or rewards for continuing to support the application. So we find that that's very important in engagement of subjects.
Allie, I think we lost your audio.
Janine, if you can hear me, how about if we pick up with the next slide in the hope that Allie can regain? Okay, so I'll continue and hope that Allie can regain her connection. She's going to be talking about remote monitoring momentarily. But one of the things that Allie was going to point out is that there are a number of digital health apps that facilitate remote ratings. These that are on this slide are a snapshot of those available. It's certainly not an all-inclusive list, but it's a snapshot of the types of services that are out there. There are many, and these organizations can be investigated to determine how they can help to support those remote ratings in clinical trials. Next slide, please. Now let's turn the presentation over to Lou, who's going to talk about adverse event collection.
Yeah, hi everybody. So a couple of things from a medical standpoint worth considering. First is remote adverse event collection, and adverse events are, a barometer on how the subject is doing. That is, of course, collected from their symptoms, and in the consideration of remote collection of adverse events, there's a number of means to do this. Now, many of us are very comfortable with doing phone visits, adverse event collections, and so forth. And this would be very similar in that regard. And so you would ask the usual non-directive questions: how have you been feeling, and how are things going, and so forth, follow-up questions as indicated. Because sometimes we are now in the era of substituting phone calls for site visits, and we're missing a lot of that person-to-person communication. You may end up, depending on the drug under investigation or the product under investigation, you want to ask some very specific study-related questions to the participant or their caregiver in a way that would elicit adverse events that can help with decision-making processes in relationship to continued dosing or modification of dosing as the protocol specifies. And then, of course, you would record this on source as you would any in-clinic visit. There's also the possibility of using an asynchronous data collection method, which would involve text or email. And again, it's just time constrained, and that you can't get the two-way interactions, but it still is a means of collecting adverse events. And then, of course, you need to make sure you have a means of documenting the verbatim responses, text and email communications for the source documentations. The importance after you've collected the adverse events is to make sure that the investigator reviews and signs off each reported adverse event, because I mentioned earlier, many times decisions are now being made based on these adverse event collections and other information that you collect on a remote visit that needs to have some medical opinion regarding the safety of the subject before continued dosing or any change or modification in the dose. So make sure that that all is documented. Can we go to the next slide, please? This information is directed out of the FDA guidance document specifically for COVID-19. And the reference to that guidance document is in the bottom here of the slide. It's not like typical FDA guidances. It's about 8 pages and densely written and useful. But some of the comments that I think are worthy to bring forward here in that regards to, I think Gary mentioned earlier, you can screen a patient for COVID-19 symptoms without needing to modify the informed consent. That's safety for your staff and also for the subject and their family. The guidance document goes further to emphasize that should there be changes in study visit schedules, missed visits, visit discontinuations, or subject discontinuations, and in the cases that efficacy or safety endpoints are not collected. And many sponsors are contemplating streamlining the protocol, including some safety assessments and some efficacy assessments. When these are done and these modifications are made in response to the COVID-19 in particular, first of all, a fair amount of leeway will be granted by the agency and by the IRBs, but this needs to be documented, and on the specific events, the source documents need to be to reflect that these modifications are in response to the pandemic, and then any IRB requests and changes would need to make that similar reflection that this is due in response to the COVID-19 infections and our response to that. The point of this is that at the end of the day, when you're looking at the data that you have, it's very challenging to remember what variations during the trial and deviations during the trial occurred, and how best to explain them. So as we all know, documentation as we go can go a long way to explaining those deviations, and it'll make the statistician not go completely crazy and pull his or her hair out. And that's all I have for this slide.
Okay, thank you, Lou. Okay, I'm going to skip over now to the topic of drug dispensing and novel approaches to drug dispensing. I'm sure these are ideas that all of you on this call have had already in terms of how to get investigational product into the hands of subjects. Well, one way to do it outside of routine visits might be to have study staff hand deliver the investigational product to the subject, either a delivery by the study staff or by the pharmacy. We also know that within the past year or two, there are several commercial pharmacies that are already delivering prescription medication to households all over the country using couriers such as Federal Express or even the United States Postal Service. So those types of approaches might be taken in order to adapt a clinical trial methodology to the COVID-19 crisis. Some considerations may need to be given to temperature stabilizing drug and documenting the delivery in a temperature stabilized state. And there are organizations that are specialized in drug delivery in that format. Also consider any federal, state, or local laws that may impact the transfer of drug from the investigator site to the subject. But all of these are potentially viable. Obviously, if we're administering a drug, IV or by infusion, it's not going to be possible to administer that remotely or deliver it remotely. But there are other forms of drug, if it's an oral form, a tablet, or a capsule that can be easily shipped or carried to the subject, that may be a viable alternative to consider. Next slide. I'm going to talk a bit about source documentation. I'm skipping over now to source documents, when eSource is available and when eSource is not available. So when eSource is available, for those investigators sites that are familiar with eSource and already applying this technology at their sites, the great advantage may be that little, if any, change needs to be made to the data entry process. So entering data into an eSource while you're at the investigator site versus while you're doing a telemedicine or remote visit, the difference is probably really minimal. However, it's very, very important to consider network security and system security as you do this, because as many investigator sites are now moving employees into home-based positions, physicians or other clinicians or other staff who may be interacting with subjects and then documenting information in an eSource. Keep in mind, or even into an ECRF for that matter, keep in mind that these home-based workers may be using devices that are not normally connected to your network, and that can present a risk and a liability. The Department of Justice just a couple of days ago released a notice indicating that there is a rise in malware attacks related to the COVID-19 crisis. The Attorney General has already taken one organization to court, and it is a concern because there are really inappropriate players out there who are trying to prey on people, hospitals, clinics, people's fears regarding the crisis, and that's opening up windows and doors into systems that allow malware attacks to occur. So consider preventative measures such as the implementation of zero-day prevention solutions such as Sandblast, Norton, or Checkpoint. And by the way, I do want to mention we're mentioning various vendors in this presentation. We're mentioning them as a point of consideration and as a point of interest. We have no particular uh, interest or connection to these vendors, other than the fact that we've now, because of our work, have had exposure to a lot of different organizations and vendors that are trying to deal with the crisis now, and we're trying to share that information with you in order to open this dialogue. We're not trying to promote any particular vendor or service or anything like that. So I just want to be clear on that. But back to zero day. If you don't know what a zero-day vulnerability is, it is a vulnerability in software security. It's a software security flaw that is known to the software vendor, but for which there is no existing patch to close the gap. And that usually happens on day one. So some of these systems or some of these applications can identify those sentinel attacks and those zero-day attacks, and work to shut down your system or help to close the gap in a very prompt way. Um, when companies are attacked under these circumstances, very often the perpetrators are using ransomware to capture your files, lock them down and lock you out of them, and then ask you to pay a ransom in order to access your files. But you're really interacting with some bad players with that, and you don't even know if they will, once you pay them, if they will release your files back to you. There also is I don't know if it's a formal term, but I think of it as threatware, where because we're dealing with personal health information, that the perpetrator could threaten to release that personal health information out into the general public, causing obviously significant problems for your organization beyond having to simply notify patients and subjects, but could create problems for your organization and for the patients and subjects themselves. So consider the implementation of a zero-day prevention solution. Be extra cautious with emails from unknown domains or addresses. Do not open attachments or click on links with emails from unknown sources. And keep devices up to date to avoid unpatched vulnerabilities. Only trust emails from reliable sources for news on important topics. Don't rely on random emails that you might get as your source of news. One of the best practices that you can apply is using one of these zero-day prevention solutions, and also making sure that every device that attaches to your network is a device that your organization owns or controls. Okay, next slide. Enough said. Okay, so what about when eSource is not available? Well, when eSource is not available, the investigator or other clinical staff may collect data on paper source, as they usually might if they're not using an electronic medical record or an electronic source document. Collect the data on paper as usual, de-identify the source documents, and then scan the source documents into an electronic trial master file or other application. One of the systems we use, again, this is in no way meant to be an endorsement, it's just an example, is Sure Clinical. So this enables us to capture source files when they are scanned into us. Not only does this help us to obtain and track and lock down the source documents, but it facilitates remote monitoring, which Ali is going to talk about momentarily. And once you use this type of modified process to capture the source files, it's always a good practice to hang on to those paper documents for conventional filing at the investigator site, presumably once the COVID risk abates. Next slide. Okay, I'll turn it back to Ali to talk about monitoring.
Great, thank you, Dr. Zammit. As Dr. Zammit was discussing, it's important that we, for those sites that we're unable to visit, that we certainly establish a remote site monitoring plan. To implement a remote monitoring plan, it's imperative that we have collaboration between our sponsors, our investigative sites, CROs, and our vendor partners. We must share a mutual understanding and really be focused upon what type of regional restrictions we may encounter, the IRB or ethics committee requirements, be vigilant to understand ongoing updates as they occur, and also develop firm impact assessment strategies to support us as we move forward. Really, the key initiative at CliniLabs and any CRO at this point is to assure that the safety of the trial participants is observed, as Dr. Kirby spoke of, and also maintaining compliance with GCP and minimizing any risk to trial data integrity. So if we can go to the next slide. Okay. Some of the challenges that we may see in remote monitoring activities really come from the quarantines that we're all experiencing, site closures that we've seen occurring to date, any travel limitations that may be placed upon our CRAs or other team members, and the general fear of exposure to COVID-19 or harm that may occur, whether it be on the site-facing side, the CRA side, or our patient side. So if the planned on-site monitoring visits are no longer possible, we really have to consider, optimizing the use of any type of central or remote monitoring programs to ensure that we maintain the necessary oversight in the clinical trials. As Dr. Zammit discussed earlier, there are different modalities in which we can ascertain this information. One, of course, is the utilization of electronic health records. Other, of course, is source documentation, which can be delivered in an electronic format, either scanned and faxed, or maybe emailed or uploaded. Again, there is eSource, and then perhaps some sites may observe a hybrid approach of one, two, or all three of these methods. Okay, so some of the considerations we must take into account, of course, are directed, one, to our electronic health records. Typically, CRAs will be reviewing these on site. I think many of us have experiences in which we have worked with different medical facilities that utilize these electronic health records. Many of these CRAs or medical or monitoring personnel are required to take specific training to access these and sign affidavits for confidentiality. So some of the items that we want to consider here is where, of course, is this monitoring going to be taking place? Is this going to be in an open plan office or public space, or another location where others who are not authorized could actually see or review this sensitive information? So it's important that we provide our individuals who be accessing these records with clear instructions on how we should go about securing the confidentiality of these. In addition, trial participants should be notified. They must consent to any identifiers, leaving the site to be ensured that their confidentiality will be protected. Okay, next slide, please. Another item that we must consider, of course, is that increased pressure that's placed on clinical staff. It's very challenging to work as a study site during these times. Many of the CROs that I have, or colleagues that I've spoken to, are having individuals fax or scan source documents, upload to portals, and which can be somewhat taxing on the site staff. So we do need to be cognizant of this and reduce the burden, or at least make efforts to minimize the burden if possible. One item, of course, from sponsor companies or CROs is imperative that we look at, what specifically are the critical variables? Do we now require 100% source document review, or can we minimize and look at a targeted monitoring approach to ensure that we're not creating additional burden placed upon this clinic staff. Any source documentation that should be coming in should, of course, be de-identified to uphold the regulations associated with HIPAA prior to transfer. And also, we want to consider use of alternative means of oversight. Here at Clinical Labs, we really are looking towards conducting many teleconferences or video conferences to keep our site staff engaged, to keep our team members engaged, also for preparations for monitoring visits and follow-up for monitoring visits, and discussion surrounding the ongoing activities at the site. In addition, our CRO project team members, really should be aware of each site's specific processes. So when you're embarking upon developing a remote monitoring plan, you need to understand what is unique to each site, what that site's specific needs are. Are they utilizing electronic health records? Are they utilizing source documentation in a paper format or an electronic format? And really determining what is the best approach to provide remote monitoring activities to minimize the burden placed upon the sites, but to ensure that we're providing appropriate oversight and ensuring the quality and integrity of the data while observing patient safety. Okay, next slide, please.
Thank you, Ali. And I'm going to wrap up with a couple of slides that I think have to do more generally with what we're dealing with the coronavirus pandemic. In that we're all hoping for the best, of course. We'd like this to be over in a matter of weeks, although we're hearing from so many sources that may not be the case, that it may be more a matter of months. But there are some models that are actually predicting, as we move from containment to mitigation to suppression and prevention, that human nature will express itself, and that as we stay confined and get a little bit stir crazy and begin to hear that people are getting better and the number of new infections is declining and the mortality rate is declining, some models are suggesting that we as human beings will become a bit overconfident, and we'll start to go out there and we'll start to relax our social distancing practices. And as a consequence, there will be an uptick in the number of infections or new infections that occur. So, so some people have suggested that the process of or the evolution of this pandemic may actually not be one where we see a surge in cases and then a fall off, but rather a series of waves of cases. So what that means to me with respect to our clinical trial work is that yes, we want to hope for the best, but we have to prepare for the worst. So we have to think about all of these mitigation strategies and contingency plans that can be applied not only on the short term, but over the long term if needed as well. So as you're thinking about how you might make modifications to your protocols, to your IRB applications, to the work that you do at your investigator sites, thinking over the long term is probably the wise thing to do. And if it turns out differently, then it's to everyone's benefit. Now let's go to the next slide. I did want to end, I think, on a positive note, despite the tragic circumstances that so many people have encountered with regard to their own health and well-being, or the health and well-being of their loved ones through this crisis. I think that there are some positive sides of this, and that for many years we've been talking about the use of telehealth or telemedicine services. The industry, as you all know, has talked about virtual trials for years. A catchphrase or catch term that many sponsors and CROs and investigator sites have used over the past couple of years is patient-centric trials. In other words, the patient doesn't go to the clinic, essentially or go to the trial. Essentially, the trial goes to the patient, and in doing so, the patient or subject might be using devices, e-pro devices, or perhaps even using wearables. And this has been, of course, another trend that's been taking place in the industry. Actigraphy, ECG, blood pressure monitoring, movement assessment, movement of extremities, say, following a stroke, gait assessment in Parkinson's disease, tremor assessment in tardive dyskinesia or other types of movement disorders. All of these things have been talked about for quite some time. This crisis may force us to a tipping point where all of these things are going to happen. They are going to happen. And I think once the genie is out of the bottle, I personally doubt that it's going to be put back in. I think this is going to represent a fundamental change in the way we design clinical trials and the way clinical trials are conducted in investigator sites all over the world. So this actually may represent a positive shift in our own industry that will lead to more efficient, better methods of conducting clinical trials and getting medicines to people who need them faster and at less expense. So with that, I will close, and we do have a little time for questions.
Just as a reminder, if you'd like to enter a question, you could do it in the interaction panel, which should be on the right of your screen. So far, we have received a few questions. They're all related to whether or not we can provide a copy of the slides. A copy of the slides will be provided by email, as well as a link to the recording of today's presentation. If there are no other questions, we'll conclude for the day. We appreciate everybody's time and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you all.